Amala stood at the edge of her garden, her fingers trailing along the delicate petals of the hibiscus flowers that flourished under the intense African sun. These flowers were a labor of love, a silent escape from the restlessness that had settled into her life. The vibrant colors of the petals seemed to taunt her, their vitality contrasting starkly with the quiet dullness that filled her days. It was on a particularly warm afternoon, with the scent of earth heavy in the air, that she noticed him, Kofi, her neighbor living just on the other side of the fence, separated from her by a simple line of bamboo reeds. She'd seen him many times before, of course, but never quite like this. The late afternoon light cast a golden glow over his frame as he tended to his small vegetable patch, his strong hands moving skillfully through the rows of plants. Every movement he made was unhurried, almost reverent, as if each task deserved his full presence. Amal found herself captivated. There was a quiet, earthy energy in him, something that called to her in a way that was both familiar and foreign. His worn shirt clung to his back, dampened by the day's work, and every muscle seemed to speak of years spent mastering his craft, learning the rhythm of the land. She marveled at how focused he was, unaware of her gaze, lost in his own world. It had been a long time since she had seen such undistracted dedication in anyone. Her husband, by contrast, was a man of numbers, a man whose life revolved around papers and figures that meant little to her. He spent his time in closed, air-conditioned rooms, his hands unmarked by labor, his skin softened by years away from the fields. He was often absent, physically and emotionally drifting through their home like a ghost bound to routines and expectations. She had accepted this distance long ago, burying her longing in her garden, in the small, unspoken beauty of things that required no explanation. But today, as she watched Kofi, something within her stirred, like a long-buried seed finally pushing through the earth to feel the sun. The garden fence was just tall enough to provide privacy, but low enough to allow glimpses between them. She began to notice small details, the way he would occasionally pause to wipe his brow with the back of his hand, his shoulders rising and falling in a steady rhythm as he worked. She found herself drawn to these simple gestures, these moments of quiet strength that seemed so effortless in him. It was absurd, she knew, to feel this way over something as mundane as a man working his garden. And yet she found herself returning to the fence each afternoon, her hands busily tending to her own plants as her eyes drifted towards him. She took great care to appear casual, to hide the quickening of her pulse whenever he came into view. It became a game, a ritual, something that added a spark of anticipation to her otherwise predictable routine. As the days passed, Amal became acutely aware of his presence, even when he wasn't there. The garden seemed different now, as if it held secrets between them, secrets born of glances and shared silences. She could feel the subtle energy between them growing, as real as the roots that spread unseen beneath the soil. There were no words exchanged, no acknowledgments of the glances that lingered just a little too long, and yet she felt as if she knew him in a way that defied logic. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of purple and orange, Amal lingered a little longer in her garden. She could see Kofi on the other side, his silhouette softened by the twilight. She watched him as he stood there, taking in the quietness of the evening, his hands resting on his hips as he looked out over his plants. There was a peace in him that she envied, a sense of belonging that she had never quite found. In the stillness, her mind wandered. She wondered what it would be like to be near him, to feel the warmth of his presence beside her. She imagined his hands, calloused yet gentle, touching her own, grounding her in a way she had not felt in years. It was a foolish thought, she told herself, a flight of fancy. But the longing that had taken root in her heart would not be so easily dismissed. Amal's life was filled with small, calculated steps, a delicate balance of duty and restraint. She had learned to find contentment in the little things, in the quiet spaces between her husband's comings and goings. But now, in these moments by the fence, she felt the fragile walls she had built around her heart beginning to crumble. As the last light faded, she finally turned to go back inside. She moved slowly, as if unwilling to break the spell that had settled over the garden. But before she could step away, she caught one final glance of Kofi. This time he was looking in her direction. Their eyes met, a brief moment stretched into eternity, neither of them moving, neither of them speaking. There was a warmth in his gaze, a quiet understanding that seemed to reach across the distance between them. Amal felt her heart quicken, the silence between them filling with possibilities she dared not name. There was something comforting and exhilarating in that look, a spark that threatened to set her entire being aflame. But just as quickly as it began, the moment passed. She looked away, her cheeks flushed, her heart pounding as if she had just run a great distance. In the solitude of her room that night, she lay awake, replaying the day's encounters in her mind. The world seemed different now, her once familiar garden transformed into a place filled with secrets and silent promises. And as she drifted into restless sleep, she found herself longing for tomorrow, for another glimpse across the fence that separated them. She knew it was a dangerous game, this unspoken dance between them. But for the first time in years she felt truly alive, as if she were rediscovering herself in the reflection of his gaze. The world outside her window seemed to hold its breath, waiting, like her, for what was yet to come. In the days that followed, Amal's life took on a new rhythm, one punctuated by fleeting encounters with Kofi that left her breathless and rattled. It was as if the earth itself had conspired to pull them together in quiet, inconspicuous places on the path to the village, in the fields, or under the wide, sprawling branches of the ancient baobab tree that had watched over her land for generations. One morning, as the sky blushed with the first light of dawn, Amal was drawn to the village well, her steps slow and contemplative. She hadn't expected to see anyone so early, and yet there he was, Kofi, his figure silhouetted against the soft light, his shoulders broad, his posture calm and steady. He was filling a large jug, his hands working methodically, with a patience that seemed to flow from the earth itself. Amal froze, suddenly aware of her heartbeat thundering in her chest. She hadn't anticipated the effect he would have on her, the way his simple presence stirred a longing that felt as natural and as ancient as the land beneath her feet. He noticed her then, looking up with a quiet intensity that seemed to reach across the distance between them. His gaze, dark and unflinching, met hers, and the air thickened, humming with an energy that neither dared to name. She stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she moved toward the well. There were no words exchanged, only the soft crunch of gravel underfoot as she approached him. Kofi held out his jug, his hand steady and assured, and as she reached out to take it, her fingers brushed against his. The warmth of his skin against hers sent a shiver down her spine, a shock of connection that lingered even after she withdrew her hand. The brief touch seemed to ignite something within her, a fire she hadn't felt in years. Amal had spent so long existing in a state of quiet resignation, buried under layers of duty and propriety. But now, in that single moment, those layers began to peel away, leaving her raw and vulnerable, her heart exposed. She lowered her gaze, not wanting him to see the storm that was rising within her, yet unable to pull herself away from him entirely. The days passed, and their paths continued to cross with an almost painful regularity. She would see him at the market, his back turned as he bartered with the vendors, his laughter mingling with the hum of the crowd. Or she would catch sight of him in the fields, his hands working the soil, his figure outlined against the bright expanse of sky. Each encounter left her with a sense of restless anticipation, a feeling that settled deep within her bones and refused to fade. One afternoon, as she walked home with a basket of vegetables, she found herself once again in his presence. He was standing near the path that led to her home, his gaze fixed on something distant, his posture relaxed but purposeful. She slowed her steps, her heart quickening as she approached. It felt as though the very air around them was alive, charged with an unspoken tension that neither could ignore. Without a word, Kofi turned to face her, his eyes softening as they met hers. He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking to a mere breath. The silence was thick, almost tangible, filled with the weight of everything they wanted to say but couldn't. Amal felt her resolve weakening, felt herself surrendering to the quiet intensity of his presence. She could feel his warmth, could see the gentle rise and fall of his chest, each breath mirroring her own. Her pulse raced as he lifted his hand, his fingers brushing against the side of her face, so light and delicate that it felt like a whisper. The touch was fleeting, almost hesitant, as if he too was afraid of crossing an invisible line. But in that moment the world around them faded, leaving only the two of them suspended in time. Amal's breath hitched, her skin tingling where his fingers had grazed her. The sensation lingered, seeping into her like rain soaking into dry earth, filling a void she hadn't even realized existed. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for answers, for something to ground her in the midst of the storm that had taken root within her. Kofi's gaze softened, his eyes filled with a warmth that seemed to speak of understanding, of shared secrets and unspoken dreams. There was a gentleness in his expression, a silent reassurance that she hadn't felt in years. Amal's heart swelled, her defenses crumbling as she allowed herself to lean into that feeling, to let herself be vulnerable in his presence. But just as quickly as the moment had come, it was gone. Kofi pulled back, his hand falling to his side as he stepped away, his expression guarded once more. The spell was broken, leaving Amal standing alone, her heart aching with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. That night, as she lay awake, the memory of his touch haunted her, the ghost of his fingers still lingering on her skin. She knew that what she felt for him was forbidden, that it went against every vow she had made, every promise she had kept. But she also knew that she couldn't stop herself from wanting him, from yearning for the warmth and understanding that only he seemed to offer. In the days that followed, the encounters became more frequent, more intense. A glance across the marketplace, a brush of hands as they passed each other on the path, each interaction fueling the fire that burned between them. She could feel herself losing control, slipping further into a world of longing and desire that threatened to consume her entirely. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the land, Amal found herself standing at the edge of her garden, her gaze fixed on the small house across the way. She could see Kofi through the window, his figure silhouetted against the fading light, his posture relaxed and at ease. She watched him, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with thoughts she could barely contain. And then, as if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the distance that separated them. In that moment she knew that the barrier between them was only an illusion, a fragile thing that could be shattered with a single step, a single act of courage. Amal felt her breath catch, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She knew that what lay ahead was uncertain, that the path she was contemplating was fraught with danger and consequences she could barely fathom. But as she stood there, caught in the intensity of his gaze, she realized that she was ready to risk it all, to follow the pull that had brought them together, no matter where it might lead. For the first time in years she felt alive, her heart beating with a rhythm that was both foreign and achingly familiar. And as the last light faded from the sky, she took a step forward, her mind racing, her body trembling with anticipation. There was no turning back now. The choice had been made, the path set. All that remained was to see where it would lead. As the days slipped by, Amal felt her existence shift, as if an invisible thread bound her to Kofi, pulling her closer to him in ways she couldn't explain. The silence between them was not empty but laden with meaning, an unspoken language that only they seemed to understand. Every look, every lingering glance, every fleeting touch carried a weight that left her breathless. One afternoon, while out gathering herbs near the edge of her property, Amal sensed his presence even before she saw him. There was a subtle shift in the air, a feeling of warmth and tension, as if the very earth beneath her feet vibrated with his energy. She turned, and there he was, standing a few paces away, his gaze steady and unwavering. Their eyes met, and Amal felt a surge of something powerful and consuming, a force she hadn't felt in years. She felt stripped bare, vulnerable, as if he could see straight into her heart. into the places she had kept hidden even from herself. It was terrifying, exhilarating, like standing on the edge of a cliff and feeling the pull of gravity tugging her forward. She held his gaze, unable to look away, caught in the intensity of his dark, unreadable eyes. The silence between them thickened, and for a moment she felt as if the world around them had faded, leaving only the two of them in a space outside of time. She was acutely aware of his breathing, of the rise and fall of his chest, the subtle movement of his hand as he reached out, as if drawn to her by some invisible force. The tips of his fingers brushed against hers, light as a whisper, and her pulse quickened, her skin tingling at the point of contact. It was such a small gesture, barely even a touch, yet it held a depth of feeling that left her shaken. She felt as though he had reached into her chest and touched her heart, igniting a fire that spread through her veins, leaving her breathless and wanting. Kofi's gaze never wavered, his eyes searching hers as if looking for something, as if he, too, felt the magnetic pull between them. Amahel felt a surge of longing, a need so deep and raw that it frightened her. She wanted to step closer, to close the distance between them, to feel his warmth, his strength. But something held her back, a fear that if she gave in to this feeling, it would consume her entirely. Days turned into nights, and Amal found herself haunted by his presence even when he wasn't there. She could feel him in the stillness of her room, in the shadows that crept across the walls, in the quiet moments when she was alone with her thoughts. It was as if he had left an imprint on her soul, a mark that she could not erase. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, Amal ventured to the edge of her garden. She was drawn to the bamboo fence that separated their properties, the place where they had shared so many silent moments, where their connection had taken root and grown, deep and unspoken. She stood there, her fingers grazing the rough texture of the bamboo, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and longing. She could feel the energy between them, a current that pulsed through the air, connecting them in ways that defied logic. She didn't know if he was there, if he was watching her, but she could feel him, feel his presence as real and tangible as the ground beneath her feet. As the light faded, casting everything in a warm, golden glow, she saw him. He stood on the other side of the fence, his face partially hidden in shadow, his posture relaxed but alert, as if he had been waiting for her. Their eyes met, and in that moment she felt a surge of emotion so powerful it left her breathless. She felt seen, truly seen, in a way that no one had ever seen her before. They stood there in silence, the distance between them both infinite and insignificant. The air was thick with tension, a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying. Amal felt as if she was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, a precipice that beckoned her forward, promising both ecstasy and ruin. She reached out, her hand hovering just above the fence, as if testing the boundary between them. Kofi mirrored her movement, his hand meeting hers with a gentleness that belied the intensity of his gaze. Their fingers touched, and Amal felt a jolt of electricity shoot through her, a shock that left her trembling. In that moment she felt as if she was on fire, her skin tingling, her heart racing, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in years, as if every nerve ending in her body had come alive, attuned to the energy that pulsed between them. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, a feeling that left her dizzy and unsteady, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. Kofi's hand tightened slightly around hers, his touch firm and steady, grounding her, anchoring her in the midst of the storm that raged within her. She looked into his eyes, and in that moment she saw a reflection of her own desire, her own longing mirrored back at her. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding that transcended words, a bond that went beyond the physical. They stood there, their hands entwined, their gazes locked, lost in the intensity of the moment. Amal felt as if she was on the brink of something profound, something that had the power to change her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. She knew that this connection, this bond between them, was dangerous, that it threatened to unravel everything she had built, everything she had held dear. But in that moment she didn't care. She was willing to risk it all, to surrender to the pull of this connection, to let it take her wherever it would lead. She felt a surge of courage, a boldness that surprised her, a willingness to defy convention, to break free from the constraints that had bound her for so long. Slowly, reluctantly, they released their hands, the loss of contact leaving her feeling hollow, as if a part of her had been torn away. But the connection remained, a thread that bound them together, a promise of something more, something that went beyond the physical. As Amal turned to leave, she felt a strange sense of peace, a calmness that settled over her, soothing the turmoil that had plagued her for so long. She knew that this connection, this bond, was something rare and precious, something that she would carry with her always. In the days that followed, she found herself drawn back to that place, to the fence that separated them, to the space where their hands had touched, where their connection had deepened. It became a sanctuary, a place where she could be herself, where she could feel, truly feel, without fear or judgment. Amal knew that this connection was forbidden, that it went against everything she had been taught, everything she had believed in. But she also knew that it was real, that it was something she could not deny, something she could not walk away from. And as she stood there, her hand resting on the fence, her heart full of longing and hope, she felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. She was ready to embrace this connection, to let it guide her, to see where it would lead. For the first time in her life, she felt free, free to be herself, free to love, free to feel. And as the sun set, casting its golden glow over the land, Amal knew that she had found something worth fighting for, something worth risking everything for. She was ready to follow this connection, to see where it would take her, to surrender to the pull of her heart. And in that moment she felt a sense of peace, a sense of joy, a sense of purpose. She was ready to let go, to embrace the unknown, to step into the light and follow her heart, wherever it might lead. The evening air was thick, wrapped in the scent of jasmine and warm earth as Amal waited, her heart pounding with a rhythm that seemed to echo in the stillness around her. The world was quiet, cloaked in the secrecy of the late hour. Shadows stretched across the land, wrapping her in their cool embrace, as if they too understood the significance of what was about to unfold. This was the night she had both feared and longed for, a night stolen from the routines of her life, hidden from prying eyes and the relentless expectations that bound her. Her husband had left for business in the village, his absence a window that would close as quickly as it had opened. Amal's pulse quickened at the thought, her skin alive with anticipation, her senses sharpened to every faint sound, every whisper of the wind. A soft knock at the door brought her back to herself, pulling her from the whirlpool of thoughts that had consumed her. She took a steadying breath, her hand hovering over the handle, a quiet tremor betraying the calm she tried to project. Slowly she opened the door, and there he was, Kofi, standing in the threshold, his expression both unreadable and filled with a depth that took her breath away. He stepped inside without a word, the door closing softly behind him, sealing them off from the world outside. The room felt smaller with him there, the space between them charged, heavy with all the emotions they had kept locked away. Amal's gaze lingered on him, taking in the quiet strength in his posture, the warmth that seemed to radiate from him in waves, filling the room with a sense of intimacy that bordered on sacred. They stood there, just a breath apart, their eyes locked in a silent exchange, a conversation that needed no words. The unspoken understanding between them was overwhelming, a force that transcended the boundaries they had both kept so carefully intact. Amal's heart pounded, a wild, unsteady beat that seemed to fill the silence, drowning out everything else. Kofi lifted his hand slowly, his fingers brushing lightly against her cheek, the touch as delicate as a whisper. Amal closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, feeling the warmth of his hand against her skin, the roughness of his calloused fingers a stark contrast to the gentleness of his caress. She felt as if she was melting, dissolving into that simple touch, her carefully constructed walls crumbling, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in a way she had never allowed herself to be. Without a word, Kofi's hand slid down, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch a slow, deliberate exploration that sent a shiver down her spine. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze once more, and in that moment she saw everything she had ever wanted reflected back at her. It was a look of tenderness, of longing, of a love so deep and fierce it left her breathless. Time seemed to lose its meaning as they stood there, suspended in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. Amal's hand found its way to his, their fingers intertwining, a silent vow passing between them. There was a sweetness in the simplicity of that touch, a purity that spoke of the bond they shared, a connection that went beyond the physical, beyond the boundaries of time and circumstance. And then, as if moved by some unseen force, Kofi leaned forward, his forehead resting gently against hers. Amal closed her eyes, savoring the warmth of his breath on her skin, the steady beat of his heart in perfect rhythm with her own. She felt a sense of peace wash over her, a calm that settled deep within her, grounding her, anchoring her in the midst of the storm that had raged within her for so long. They stayed like that, locked in a silent embrace, their bodies pressed close, their breaths mingling, each one a promise, a confession, a plea. It was a moment of surrender, a moment where the world outside faded, leaving only the two of them, bound together in a connection that defied explanation. Finally, as the night deepened and the world outside grew still, Kofi pulled back, his hand lingering on her cheek, his gaze lingering on her face, as if memorizing every detail, every line, every shadow. Amal felt a pang of sadness, a bittersweet ache that settled in her chest, a reminder of the fleeting nature of this moment, of the reality that would soon return. He took a step back, and she felt the loss of his warmth, the emptiness that filled the space between them. But even as he moved away, the connection remained, a thread that bound them, a promise that lingered in the silence. Amal watched as he left, her heart both heavy and light, a strange mix of sorrow and joy, of regret and fulfillment. She knew that this night would stay with her, etched into her memory, a secret she would carry with her always, a part of her soul that would forever be entwined with his. As the door closed behind him, Amal stood there, alone once more, the quiet of the night settling around her like a shroud. But she felt different, changed, as if she had discovered a part of herself she had long forgotten, a part of her that had been awakened by his touch, by the warmth of his embrace. And as she made her way to bed, her heart still racing, her skin still tingling with the memory of his touch, she knew that this was only the beginning. In the days following their secret meeting, Amal was haunted by an aching emptiness that clung to her like a shadow. Her mind drifted to Kofi constantly, and the memory of his touch lingered on her skin like a whisper she couldn't silence. Yet beneath the warmth of that memory, an icy wave of guilt surged, pulling her into its depths and leaving her breathless. Amal found herself moving through her daily life like a ghost, disconnected from everything around her. Her husband's absence had become both a blessing and a curse, offering her solitude yet forcing her to face the raw truth of what she had done. She had crossed an invisible line, allowed herself to be swept away, and now there was no returning to the life she had known before. In the quiet hours of the night, she lay awake, her heart torn between longing and regret. The dark ceiling above seemed vast and unyielding, mirroring the weight in her chest, pressing down on her until she felt she might suffocate under its weight. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to quell the storm of emotions that churned within her, but nothing could erase the memory of Kofi, the feel of his presence, his warmth, his gaze. It was as if he had left a part of himself with her, an invisible mark that bound her to him, regardless of the vows she had once made. Amal's mind raced with questions, doubts that echoed in the silence, each one a dagger that pierced her heart. How could she have betrayed the man who had shared her life for so many years? How could she have let herself be drawn so deeply into this forbidden connection? And yet, even in the midst of her guilt, there was a part of her that yearned for him, that longed to feel his touch once more, to be held in his arms, safe and cherished. She tried to push those thoughts away, to bury them beneath layers of duty and loyalty, but they clawed their way back to the surface, refusing to be silenced. She began to avoid the garden, the place where their connection had first taken root. The sight of the bamboo fence, the familiar scent of the flowers she had once tended so carefully, all of it served as a reminder of what she had shared with Kofi, a reminder of the passion that had bloomed between them in the shadows of her world. She could feel the pull, a magnetic force drawing her back to him, yet her conscience held her firmly in place, binding her to a life she had once accepted without question. Days blurred into nights, and Amal grew restless, a captive of her own heart. She was caught between two worlds, one where duty bound her to the life she had known, and another where her spirit soared, unfettered, in the warmth of Kofi's embrace. Each passing day made the chasm between these worlds feel wider, the choice she faced more impossible. She found herself retreating, pulling back from the people around her, the friends and neighbors who would never understand the depth of her turmoil, the rawness of her heart. She wore a mask of calm, a serene smile that hid the storm within, but inside she was unraveling, caught in a spiral of guilt and longing that threatened to consume her entirely. In moments of solitude, she would close her eyes and imagine him, feel the memory of his touch, the warmth of his breath against her skin. She knew it was wrong, knew that each thought of him was another betrayal, yet she couldn't stop herself. It was as if her soul had been split in two, one half bound to the life she had always known, the other reaching out to him, to the forbidden freedom he represented. Amala knew that this path could only lead to heartbreak, that there would be a price to pay for the love she felt, a love that defied the boundaries of her world. Yet, even as guilt clawed at her, even as the weight of her choices threatened to drown her, a part of her clung to that feeling, that spark of life that Kofi had awakened within her. She stood at her window, looking out over the land, her heart heavy with the burden of her secret. The night stretched out before her, vast and unforgiving, a mirror to the longing that burned within her. And in the stillness she whispered his name, a confession carried only by the darkness, a plea for the courage to face the truth of what she had become. Amala knew that she could not continue like this, torn between two worlds, her heart bound by the chains of guilt and desire. She would have to make a choice, to find a way to live with the consequences of her actions, to face the truth of her heart, no matter how painful it might be. But for now she lingered in the shadows, holding on to the memory of his touch, the warmth of his gaze, even as the guilt threatened to consume her. And as dawn broke on the horizon, Amala knew that her life could never be the same, that she had been forever changed by a love that defied explanation, a love that had both saved and destroyed her. Amal had spent countless sleepless nights wrestling with her feelings, but one evening a profound quiet settled within her. She understood now that she could no longer live divided, torn between the woman she had been and the woman she had become. The reality of her connection with Kofi had changed her in ways she could no longer ignore, and finally she felt ready to confront the truth, to acknowledge the love that had grown like roots within her heart, binding her to him in ways both beautiful and irreversible. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with the soft hues of dusk, Amal walked through her garden, each step feeling deliberate, like a journey toward herself. The familiar path, lined with flowers and shrubs she had tended for years, felt different tonight, each leaf, each petal whispering of memories and possibilities. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against the earth, grounding her in its cool, steady embrace. She had always found solace here, among the quiet, growing things, but tonight her garden held a different kind of peace. It was no longer a place to escape, it was a place to reflect, a place where she could lay down her fears and finally acknowledge the feelings she had carried so silently, so secretly. Her heart beat with a calm, steady rhythm as she let herself remember, as she allowed herself to relive every touch, every glance, every silent confession she had shared with Kofi. For so long she had been caught in the web of duty, bound to a life that had become a ritual of routine and expectation. She had accepted this as her fate, had convinced herself that contentment would one day settle in, like the soft dust that clung to her home after a dry season. But Kofi had shattered that illusion, had reminded her of the pulse of life, of the hunger for connection and love that she had buried deep within. His presence had awakened something dormant in her, something powerful and undeniable. And now, with the cool earth beneath her and the sky stretching out infinitely above, she allowed herself to accept it fully, without fear, without guilt. She could no longer deny the love that had blossomed within her, nor could she ignore the woman she had discovered through him, a woman who had the courage to feel, to desire, to live. In the stillness she felt her heart expand, a calm spreading through her like ripples across water. She knew that this love came with a cost, that it existed outside the bounds of her marriage, her vows, her past life. But in this moment she understood that love itself was not the betrayal. The betrayal would have been to deny herself, to deny the truth of her heart, to continue pretending that she was the same woman she had been before she met him. A soft breeze stirred the leaves, brushing her face, as if nature itself acknowledged her acceptance. She closed her eyes, feeling the coolness on her skin, a quiet blessing, a gentle reminder that life was as transient as the seasons, that everything changed, shifted, evolved. She understood now that her love for Kofi was part of that change, a chapter in the story of her life that would remain with her, no matter what path she chose. Amal knew that returning to her husband would be a choice made not from guilt, but from an understanding of who she had become. She could face him with a newfound honesty, no longer hiding behind a facade of compliance and routine. She could be the woman who had loved, who had let herself be vulnerable, and who had found the strength to acknowledge her desires. The next morning, as dawn broke over the village, she found herself standing by the bamboo fence, her fingers tracing its rough surface, each groove familiar yet strangely foreign, like a memory held in the body long after the mind has forgotten. She knew Kofi would not be there, that he would be working in his field, lost in his own world, but she felt his presence with her nonetheless, his quiet strength, his silent understanding. Amal closed her eyes, letting herself feel the weight of his absence, the ache of a love that could never be fully realized. But instead of pain, she felt a quiet acceptance, a peace that settled over her like a warm blanket, wrapping her in its gentle embrace. She had loved him deeply, and that love had given her something she hadn't known. She was missing, a sense of herself, a wholeness that she could carry forward. She took one last look at the garden, at the places where they had shared stolen glances and unspoken promises. Each corner held a memory, each plant a witness to their silent connection. But now she felt ready to let it go, to walk away without regret, carrying only the beauty of what they had shared within her. As Amal made her way back to her house, she felt lighter, as if a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. She understood that her love for Kofi was a part of her now, woven into the fabric of her being, but it did not have to define her or consume her. She could hold it close, a quiet ember glowing within her, warming her heart without demanding anything in return. That evening, when her husband returned from his trip, she greeted him with a smile that felt genuine, unforced. She looked at him with new eyes, seeing not just the man he was but the life they had built together, the shared moments, the quiet companionship that had, in its own way, sustained her. It was not the wild, consuming love she had felt with Kofi, but it was real, it was steady, and it was enough. As they sat together in the fading light, Amal felt a sense of peace settle over her, a calm that came from knowing who she was, from accepting the journey that had brought her to this moment. She knew she would always carry Kofi with her, that his presence would linger in her heart like a favorite song, a memory that would resurface in quiet moments, reminding her of the woman she had discovered within herself. But she also knew that she was strong enough to let him go, to walk forward with her head held high, unburdened by guilt or regret. She was not bound by the past, nor by the weight of unfulfilled dreams. She was free, truly free, to embrace the life before her, to live with an open heart, to be true to herself in ways she had never known before. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, Amal felt a quiet joy fill her, a joy that came not from possessing but from loving deeply, fiercely, without expectation or demand. She had loved, and she had learned to let go. And in that acceptance she found a new beginning, a place where peace and passion could coexist, where she could be both the woman who had loved and the woman who would continue forward, forever changed yet whole.